Maria Santos wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished mopping the small restaurant floor for the third time that evening. The clock on the cracked wall showed 10:30 p.m., but she knew her day was far from over. At 22, she had already lived through more hardship than most people twice her age. Her calloused hands told the story of someone who had been working since she was 14, taking on any job she could find to help support her family. The restaurant where she worked was nothing fancy, just a small neighborhood place that served simple meals to working-class people in their community. The pay was minimal, but every peso counted in the Santos household. Maria's father, Roberto, had been out of work for 8 months now, ever since the construction company he worked for suddenly shut down, leaving dozens of workers without jobs or final paychecks. Roberto Santos sat at their kitchen table that same evening, staring at a stack of bills and notices that seemed to grow larger each day. His weathered face, marked by years of hard labor under the sun, showed the strain of their current situation. At 55, he had always been the provider for his family, working since he was 12 years old, to support first his younger siblings, then his wife and children. The inability to find steady work was eating away at his pride more than any physical pain ever could. The Santos family lived in a modest 2-bedroom house in a working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, but it had been their home for 15 years. Roberto had bought it with a loan from a local moneylender when banks wouldn't approve him for a mortgage due to his informal employment status. At the time, it had seemed like the only option to give his family a stable place to live. The loan had started small, but the interest rates were crushing. What began as a manageable monthly payment had slowly grown into an impossible burden, especially with Roberto's recent unemployment. The moneylender, Vicente Morales, was known throughout the neighborhood as someone who helped people when banks wouldn't, but also as someone who always collected what was owed to him, one way or another. Maria's mother, Carmen, had passed away 3 years earlier from cancer. The medical bills from her treatment had drained what little savings the family had managed to accumulate. Roberto had borrowed additional money from Morales to pay for his wife's final months of care, hoping against hope that somehow she would recover and they could rebuild their lives together. Her death had left both Roberto and Maria devastated, not just emotionally, but financially as well. In the months following Carmen's death, Roberto had managed to keep up with the loan payments through his construction work. But when the company folded and jobs became scarce, the payments stopped. Morales had been patient at first, understanding that Roberto was a man of his word who had always paid his debts before. But patience only lasted so long in the money-lending business. Maria knew about their financial struggles, though her father tried to shield her from the worst of it. She saw the worry lines deepen on his face each day, noticed how he barely touched his food at dinner, claiming he wasn't hungry so there would be more for her. She had offered to take on extra work, to find a second job, but Roberto's pride wouldn't allow his daughter to carry the burden that he felt was his responsibility alone. The truth was that Roberto owed Morales nearly 200,000 pesos, an amount that would take years to pay off even if he found steady work immediately. The interest continued to compound monthly, making the debt feel like a weight that grew heavier with each passing day. Roberto had tried to negotiate with Morales to arrange a payment plan that would work with his limited income from occasional odd jobs, but the moneylender's patience was wearing thin. Vicente Morales was not a cruel man by nature, but he was a businessman first. He had his own responsibilities, his own family to feed, and his own creditors to satisfy. The money he lent out came from somewhere, and when people didn't pay, it affected his entire operation. He had given Roberto more time than he usually gave others, partly out of respect for the man's previous reliability, and partly because he had known Carmen and felt sympathy for the family's loss. But sympathy didn't pay bills, and Morales was facing pressure from his own associates to collect outstanding debts. The informal lending business operated on reputation and fear in equal measure. If word got out that debts could go unpaid without consequences, it would undermine his entire operation and put his own family's security at risk. Maria sensed that something more serious was happening when she noticed her father spending hours at the kitchen table, not eating or sleeping, just staring at papers and occasionally putting his head in his hands. When she tried to ask him about it, he would force a smile and tell her not to worry, that everything would work out somehow. But Maria had inherited her mother's intuition, and she could see through her father's attempts to protect her from their reality. The neighborhood where they lived was tight-knit, and word traveled fast about people's troubles. Maria had heard whispers at the market about families who had fallen behind on their payments to Morales, and how those situations were typically resolved. Some people lost their homes, others were forced to work off their debts in ways that left them trapped for years. The stories frightened her, but she tried not to let her imagination run wild. Roberto had been looking for work every day, walking from construction site to construction site, checking with former colleagues and friends in the industry. The economic situation in their city made jobs scarce, and companies that were hiring could afford to be selective. At 55, Roberto found himself competing with men 20 years younger who were willing to work for less money and had more energy for the physical demands of construction work. The rejection hurt more than Roberto let on. He had always been strong, reliable, someone that employers could count on. His reputation in the construction industry had been built over decades of showing up on time, working hard, and treating his colleagues with respect. But in a tough economy, reputation only went so far when there were younger, cheaper alternatives available. As the weeks passed, the stress began to take a visible toll on Roberto's health. He was losing weight, sleeping poorly, and Maria noticed that his hands sometimes shook when he thought no one was looking. She wanted desperately to help, but every time she brought up getting a second job or borrowing money from friends, Roberto would become agitated and insist that it was his problem to solve. The community around them was struggling too, which meant that borrowing from friends or neighbors wasn't really an option. Everyone was dealing with their own financial pressures, and the informal support networks that had sustained families through difficult times in the past were strained to their limits. Even the local church, which had always been a source of emergency assistance for families in crisis, was overwhelmed with requests for help. Maria had finished her high school education, but college had never been financially feasible for the Santos family. Instead, she had gone straight to work, hoping to contribute to their household income and maybe save enough money to pursue further education later. Those dreams seemed very far away now, as every peso she earned went toward their basic survival needs. The restaurant job was Maria's primary source of income, but she also did occasional cleaning work for neighbors and helped elderly women in their community with shopping and household tasks. Her days typically started before dawn and didn't end until late at night, but she never complained. She had watched her parents work tirelessly throughout her childhood, and she understood that hard work was simply part of life for people in their situation. Despite their struggles, Maria tried to maintain a positive outlook. She had inherited her mother's strength and optimism, along with her father's determination to never give up in the face of adversity. She often found herself remembering conversations with her mother about the importance of family, about how people who truly love each other find ways to protect and support one another, no matter what challenges they face. The evening routine in the Santos household had become predictable in its quiet desperation. Roberto would sit at the kitchen table with his papers, occasionally writing in a small notebook where he tracked their expenses and debts. Maria would prepare a simple dinner with whatever ingredients they had available, and they would eat together while trying to maintain normal conversation about her workday or neighborhood news. After dinner, Maria would often find excuses to stay in the kitchen, washing dishes slowly or organizing their small pantry, because she could see that her father needed time alone with his thoughts. She respected his need for privacy while also staying close enough to provide comfort if he seemed ready to accept it. Their relationship had grown deeper and more protective since Carmen's death, but it was also marked by Roberto's fierce determination to shield Maria from problems he felt she shouldn't have to worry about. On this particular evening, as Maria finished cleaning the restaurant and prepared to walk home through the dimly lit streets, she had no way of knowing that their time of quiet struggle was about to end abruptly. Vicente Morales had made a decision about the Santos debt, and that decision would force their family crisis into the open in ways that neither Roberto nor Maria could have anticipated. The walk home from the restaurant usually took Maria about 20 minutes through streets she had known since childhood. She felt relatively safe in their neighborhood, where most people knew each other and looked out for one another. But lately, she had noticed more tension in the community, more conversations about money troubles and family stress that people couldn't quite manage to keep private. As she turned onto her street that evening, Maria noticed several men standing near the corner, talking in low voices and occasionally glancing toward her house. She recognized one of them as someone who worked for Vicente Morales, and her stomach immediately tightened with anxiety. She quickened her pace, hoping to reach home before whatever conversation was taking place had a chance to move closer to her front door. Inside their house, Roberto sat at the kitchen table with 3 official-looking documents spread out in front of him. One was a final notice from Morales, stating that payment arrangements needed to be made within 48 hours or alternative collection methods would be employed. The second was an eviction notice that would take effect if the debt wasn't resolved. The third was a letter he had started writing to Maria, trying to explain their situation and apologize for not being able to protect her from the consequences of his financial failures. Roberto had torn up and rewritten the letter to Maria several times over the past week. How could he explain to his daughter that he had failed in his most basic responsibility as a father? How could he tell her that their home, their security, everything they had left of the life he had built with Carmen, was about to be lost because of decisions he had made and circumstances he couldn't control? The sound of Maria's key in the front door interrupted Roberto's thoughts. He quickly gathered up the documents and shoved them into a drawer, then tried to compose his expression before she entered the kitchen. But Maria had spent too many years reading her father's moods to be fooled by his attempt at normalcy. She could see immediately that something was very wrong. Roberto's face was pale, and his eyes had the look of someone who had been pushed beyond their limits. The kitchen, which was usually neat and organized, showed signs of his distress, papers scattered on the counter, coffee cups left unwashed, a general sense of disorder that was completely unlike her methodical father. Maria set down her purse and approached the table carefully, as if she were trying not to startle a wounded animal. She had learned over the past months that pushing her father to talk about their problems usually made him withdraw further, so she had developed a patient approach to getting information about their situation. But tonight felt different. Tonight, there was an urgency in the air that suggested their time for gradual revelations and careful conversations had run out. As Maria looked at her father's face, she realized with growing dread that whatever had been building toward them was about to arrive, and their lives were about to change in ways that neither of them could control or prevent. The morning came too quickly for Roberto Santos, who had spent most of the night pacing around their small house, rehearsing conversations he hoped he would never have to have with his daughter. The 48-hour deadline from Vicente Morales felt like a countdown to the end of everything he had worked his entire life to build and protect. Maria noticed her father's restlessness immediately when she woke up. The coffee was already made, which was unusual since Roberto typically slept later than she did. His clothes were the same ones he had worn the day before, suggesting he had never actually gone to bed. When she tried to make eye contact with him over breakfast, he looked away, focusing intently on stirring sugar into his coffee cup. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, Roberto finally made a decision he had been avoiding for weeks. He walked to the neighborhood where Vicente Morales conducted his business, hoping to have one final conversation about extending the payment deadline or arranging some kind of work-for-debt agreement. It was a desperate move, but Roberto felt like he had to try everything possible before accepting that he might lose his home and destroy his daughter's future. The building where Morales operated was nothing impressive from the outside, just a two-story concrete structure with small offices and a repair shop on the ground floor. But everyone in the neighborhood knew that serious business was conducted there, and people only visited when they were either seeking loans or dealing with serious payment problems. Morales received Roberto in his office, a simple room with two plastic chairs, a metal desk, and a calendar on the wall showing pictures of cars that neither man could afford. Despite the informal setting, the conversation was tense from the beginning. Morales had already given Roberto more time than his usual policies allowed, and he was under pressure from his own associates to resolve outstanding debts. Roberto explained his job search efforts, showed Morales a list of places he had applied for work, and proposed a payment plan that would allow him to pay back the debt over 3 years once he found steady employment. He spoke with the dignity of someone who had always honored his commitments, hoping that his past reliability would count for something in their negotiation. Morales listened patiently, but his response was firm and final. The debt had grown too large, and the economic climate made extended payment plans too risky for his business. He needed either immediate payment of at least half the amount owed, or he would have to pursue other collection methods that neither of them would prefer. He gave Roberto until 6 o'clock that evening to produce 50,000 pesos, or their arrangement would shift to a different kind of agreement. The walk home from that meeting was the longest 20 minutes of Roberto's life. He felt like he was carrying news of his own execution, knowing that there was no possible way to produce that kind of money in a few hours. His pride, which had sustained him through decades of hard work and financial struggle, finally crumbled completely as he realized he would have to tell Maria the truth about their situation. Maria was waiting for him when he returned, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a worried expression that showed she had spent the morning preparing herself for bad news. She had called in sick to the restaurant, something she had never done before, because she sensed that this was a day when her father might need her to be present rather than working. Roberto sat down across from her and began talking in a voice that was barely above a whisper. He told her about the original loan, about the interest that had compounded over the years, about the additional money he had borrowed for Carmen's medical care. He explained how his unemployment had made payments impossible, and how their debt had now grown to an amount that would take decades to repay, even if he found good work immediately. As Roberto spoke, Maria felt a mixture of anger, fear, and deep sadness wash over her. She was angry that her father had tried to handle this burden alone, angry at the economic system that put families like theirs in impossible situations, and angry at herself for not being more insistent about learning the details of their financial problems earlier. But more than anger, she felt an overwhelming love for her father and a determination to find some way to protect him from the consequences of circumstances that were largely beyond his control. Roberto had sacrificed his entire adult life to provide for his family, working jobs that damaged his body and spending every peso on their needs rather than his own wants. When Roberto finished explaining their situation, Maria asked quiet, practical questions about their options. Could they sell their belongings? Could she work additional jobs to increase their income? Could they borrow money from other sources to pay off Morales? Roberto's answers to all of these questions were variations of not enough and too late. The afternoon passed slowly as they discussed possibilities that both of them knew were unrealistic. Maria called several friends and distant relatives, hoping someone might be able to lend them money, but everyone was dealing with their own financial pressures. The few people who had any savings were reluctant to get involved with debts owed to someone like Morales. Around 4 o'clock, Maria made a decision that she didn't discuss with her father. She walked to the building where Morales conducted his business, hoping to have a conversation about alternatives that Roberto had been too proud or too protective to explore. She had heard stories about people working off debts, and while those arrangements were never ideal, they might be better than losing their home and destroying her father's health with stress. The men in Morales' office were surprised to see a young woman asking to speak with their boss about the Santos debt. Most families sent the fathers or husbands to handle financial negotiations, and Maria's presence suggested that their situation had reached a level of desperation that required unconventional approaches. Morales agreed to see her, partly out of curiosity and partly out of respect for Roberto's previous reliability as a borrower. He offered Maria a chair and listened as she explained that she was Roberto's daughter, and that she wanted to discuss options for resolving their family's debt. Maria spoke with a composure that impressed Morales, explaining that she understood the seriousness of their situation and that she was prepared to take responsibility for helping resolve it. She asked direct questions about work arrangements, about payment plans, about any alternatives to foreclosure that might allow her father to keep his dignity while addressing their obligations. Morales found himself in an unusual position. He dealt primarily with men who had gotten in over their heads with debt, and he had standard approaches for those situations. But Maria's combination of maturity, respectfulness, and obvious love for her father created a dynamic he hadn't experienced before in his business dealings. The conversation that followed was uncomfortable for both of them, but it was conducted with a level of mutual respect that surprised Morales. Maria made it clear that she was willing to take on significant personal sacrifice to protect her father, but she also asked for clarity about what those sacrifices would involve and whether they would actually resolve their family's debt. Morales explained that Roberto's debt could be managed through a combination of immediate payment and guaranteed future income. If someone in the Santos family could produce 25,000 pesos immediately and commit to working in one of his business operations for 2 years at a predetermined wage, the remaining debt could be considered satisfied. The work he was offering was legitimate, managing one of his small retail operations, handling bookkeeping and customer service for his various business activities, and generally serving as a trusted employee in his organization. The salary would be modest but steady, and it would come with the security of knowing that the family debt was being addressed in a structured way. For Maria, this offer represented both an opportunity and a profound personal sacrifice. Taking this job would mean giving up her current work, abandoning any hopes of pursuing education or other career opportunities, and committing 2 years of her life to working for the man her family owed money to. But it would also mean protecting her father's health and dignity, keeping their home, and providing a clear path toward financial freedom. The immediate payment requirement remained a significant obstacle. 25,000 pesos was still far more money than their family had access to, and Morales couldn't reduce that requirement without creating problems with his own business operations and creditors. Maria asked for time to consider the offer and to discuss it with her father, though she was already leaning toward accepting any arrangement that would resolve their crisis without destroying Roberto's sense of self-worth. Morales gave her until 6 o'clock to make a decision, the same deadline he had given her father earlier. Walking home from that meeting, Maria felt both relieved and terrified. Relieved because there was at least a possible solution to their problem, but terrified about what accepting that solution would mean for her own future and about how her father would react when she told him about her unauthorized negotiation. Roberto was waiting anxiously when Maria returned, and his expression shifted from worry to alarm when she began describing her conversation with Morales. The idea of his daughter working for their creditor, essentially placing herself in a position of servitude to resolve debts that he had incurred, violated everything Roberto believed about his role as a father and protector. The argument that followed was the most intense emotional conversation Maria and Roberto had ever had. Roberto felt that accepting Morales's offer would represent a complete failure of his responsibilities as a parent, while Maria argued that refusing the offer would represent a failure to accept help when their family desperately needed it. Maria had never spoken to her father with such directness about their family's situation. She told him that his pride was less important than their survival, that she was an adult capable of making her own decisions about work, and that protecting her from financial responsibility wasn't protecting her at all if it meant they lost their home and he destroyed his health with stress. Roberto struggled to respond to his daughter's arguments because he knew she was right about their practical situation, even though everything in his nature rebelled against allowing her to sacrifice her future for debts that were his responsibility. The conversation forced him to confront the reality that his ability to solve their problems through his own effort had reached its limits. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, the weight of their situation settled over both of them. They were facing a choice between two forms of sacrifice. Either Roberto would accept the complete destruction of his pride, and his daughter would commit years of her life to resolving his debts, or they would lose their home and face an uncertain future with no clear path toward recovery. Around 5:30, Maria made her final argument to her father. She reminded him of conversations she had heard him have with her mother about the importance of family, about how people who love each other find ways to support one another through difficult times. She told him that accepting her help wasn't a sign of his failure, but rather evidence of the strong family foundation he and Carmen had created. Roberto looked at his daughter and saw not the child he had always tried to protect, but a young woman who had inherited the best qualities of both her parents, Carmen's strength and compassion, and his own determination to face difficulties without giving up. He realized that continuing to refuse her help wasn't protecting her. It was preventing her from expressing the same family loyalty that had driven his own sacrifices throughout his adult life. The decision they made that evening was not easy or simple, but it was made together. Maria would accept Morales's offer, and Roberto would support her decision while working to rebuild his own career so that her sacrifice would be as temporary as possible. They would face their crisis as a family, sharing both the burden and the responsibility for their recovery. As 6 o'clock approached, Maria and Roberto walked together to Morales's office, ready to begin the next chapter of their lives with a mixture of hope, fear, and determination that they would emerge from this crisis stronger than they had been before. The meeting at Vicente Morales's office that evening was formal and businesslike, which somehow made it easier for both Maria and Roberto to get through. Morales treated them with respect, explaining the work arrangement clearly and providing written documentation of their agreement. Maria would start work the following Monday, managing the daily operations of a small general store that Morales owned in a neighboring district. The job itself was legitimate and straightforward, opening the store each morning, handling sales transactions, managing inventory, and closing each evening. The salary was modest but regular, and it came with the security of knowing that each month of work brought their family closer to complete freedom from debt. Most importantly for Roberto, the arrangement was structured as employment rather than servitude, allowing Maria to maintain her dignity while fulfilling their family obligations. The 25,000 peso immediate payment requirement was resolved through a combination of sources that neither Maria nor Roberto had initially considered viable. Morales accepted Roberto's old pickup truck as collateral worth 15,000 pesos and allowed them to make up the remaining 10,000 through Maria's first 3 months of salary deductions. It wasn't an ideal solution, but it made the arrangement possible without requiring them to find money they simply didn't have. Roberto's reaction to losing his truck was complex. On one hand, the vehicle had been a symbol of his working life and independence, something he had saved for years to purchase and had maintained carefully throughout their family's financial struggles. On the other hand, giving up the truck felt like a concrete step toward resolving their crisis rather than another loss to feel guilty about. Maria's first week at the general store was challenging in ways she hadn't anticipated. The work itself was straightforward. She had retail experience from her restaurant job, and she was naturally organized and good with customers. But the psychological weight of working for their former creditor, combined with the knowledge that her father was struggling with depression about their situation, made each day feel much longer than it actually was. The store was located in a busy commercial area where Maria didn't know many people, which was both a blessing and a challenge. She didn't have to deal with neighbors who knew about her family's situation, but she also felt isolated and disconnected from the community support networks that had always been part of her life. The customers were generally pleasant, but the relationships remained purely professional rather than personal. Roberto spent Maria's first week of work attempting to restart his own job search, but with limited success. Losing the truck had eliminated some employment opportunities that required transportation, and his emotional state made it difficult for him to present himself confidently in interviews. He found himself caught between determination to rebuild their situation and depression about how dramatically their lives had changed. The dynamic between Maria and Roberto during this period required careful negotiation. Roberto wanted to be supportive of Maria's sacrifice, while also working to restore his role as the family's primary provider. Maria wanted to reassure her father that her new job was manageable, while also being honest about the challenges she was facing. Both of them were trying to maintain normalcy in a situation that felt anything but normal. After 2 weeks in her new position, Maria began to develop a different perspective on Vicente Morales and his business operations. She discovered that he employed several other people who were working off family debts, and that his approach to these arrangements was generally fair and respectful. The work was legitimate, the hours were reasonable, and he treated his employees with professionalism rather than exploitation. This realization was both reassuring and complicated for Maria. It was easier to accept her situation when she understood that Morales wasn't a predatory criminal, but rather a businessman operating within the informal economic systems that served their community. At the same time, recognizing the legitimacy of his operations made her more aware of the economic forces that had created their family's crisis in the first place. Roberto's breakthrough came in the 3rd week of Maria's employment, when a former colleague contacted him about a construction project that needed experienced workers for a 3-month contract. The job didn't offer long-term security, but it paid well and would allow Roberto to start rebuilding his professional reputation. Most importantly, it gave him something constructive to focus on, besides his guilt about Maria's situation. The change in Roberto's mood and energy when he started working again was dramatic. Maria could see the difference immediately. Her father stood straighter, spoke more confidently, and began taking an active interest in planning their family's financial recovery, rather than just dwelling on past mistakes. Having meaningful work restored Roberto's sense of purpose and his belief that their situation could continue to improve. As the weeks passed, Maria and Roberto developed a routine that allowed both of them to contribute to their family's stability while maintaining their relationship as father and daughter. They had dinner together most evenings, sharing details about their respective workdays and discussing plans for their future. These conversations helped them process the stress of their situation while also strengthening their bond as a family. 3 months into Maria's employment, Roberto's construction contract was extended, and he began receiving offers for additional projects. His reputation in the industry had survived their family's financial crisis, and employers remembered his reliability and skill. The steady income allowed them to start thinking beyond mere survival and begin planning for genuine financial recovery. Maria's work at the general store had evolved as well. She had developed good relationships with regular customers, learned to manage the business operations efficiently, and gained confidence in her abilities as a retail manager. While she still viewed the job as a temporary necessity rather than a career choice, she found satisfaction in doing the work well and contributing meaningfully to their family's recovery. The most significant development during this period was the gradual restoration of Roberto's sense of himself as a capable provider and protector. While he remained grateful for Maria's sacrifice and support, he no longer felt like a complete failure as a father. The combination of steady work and his daughter's obvious strength and competence helped him rebuild his self-respect and his optimism about their future. 6 months into their arrangement, Maria and Roberto had their first serious conversation about long-term plans that extended beyond simply fulfilling their obligation to Morales. Roberto's income had stabilized enough for them to start saving money, and Maria was learning business management skills that could potentially lead to better employment opportunities in the future. They decided that when Maria's 2-year commitment ended, she would use her experience to pursue better job opportunities while Roberto continued building his construction career toward possible self-employment. Their shared experience of financial crisis had taught them valuable lessons about budgeting, debt management, and the importance of building emergency savings that they intended to apply throughout their working lives. The relationship between their family and Vicente Morales had evolved as well. While they maintained professional boundaries, there was mutual respect for how each party had handled their agreement. Morales appreciated Maria's reliability and Roberto's efforts to rebuild his career, while they appreciated his fair treatment and willingness to structure an arrangement that preserved their dignity. A year into Maria's employment, Roberto surprised her with news that he had been offered a supervisory position on a major construction project that would provide steady income for at least 18 months. The job paid significantly more than his previous work and included benefits that would improve their overall financial security. Most importantly, it represented recognition of his skills and experience by people who respected his professional abilities. Maria's reaction to this news was complex. She felt genuine pride in her father's career recovery and relief that their long-term financial situation was improving dramatically. At the same time, she was beginning to realize that her own experience of independence and responsibility had changed her perspective on her life and her future in ways that she was still processing. Working at the general store had given Maria confidence in her abilities that she hadn't possessed before their crisis. She had learned that she was capable of handling significant responsibility, managing business operations, and building professional relationships with people from diverse backgrounds. These discoveries about herself were valuable regardless of the circumstances that had led to them. As the 18-month mark of Maria's employment approached, both she and Roberto began planning for the transition back to a more traditional family arrangement. Roberto's income was now sufficient to cover their living expenses and debt payments, and Maria would soon be free to pursue educational opportunities or career choices based on her interests rather than their family's emergency needs. The conversation they had about Maria's plans after fulfilling her commitment to Morales revealed how much both of them had grown during this difficult period. Maria expressed interest in pursuing business education, possibly with the goal of eventually starting her own retail operation. Roberto encouraged these ambitions while also offering to support whatever choices Maria made about her future. Their relationship had evolved from the traditional dynamic of protective father and dependent daughter to something more like a partnership between two adults who had successfully navigated a serious crisis together. Roberto still felt responsible for Maria's well-being, but he now also respected her judgment and capabilities in ways that he hadn't before their financial emergency forced them to relate to each other differently. The final months of Maria's commitment were marked by careful planning for their family's next phase. They had learned to communicate openly about financial matters, to make decisions collaboratively, and to support each other through stressful situations without allowing pride or fear to prevent them from accepting help when they needed it. When Maria's 2-year commitment to Morales officially ended, their family celebrated quietly but meaningfully. They had not only survived their financial crisis, but had emerged from it stronger, more resilient, and more confident about their ability to handle future challenges together. The experience had tested their relationship in ways they could never have anticipated, but it had ultimately proved the strength of the foundation that Roberto and Carmen had built for their family. Roberto's career had stabilized at a level that provided both security and satisfaction, while Maria had gained experience, confidence, and clarity about her own goals and capabilities. Their home was secure, their debts were satisfied, and their relationship had deepened through shared struggle and mutual support. Most importantly, they had learned that facing difficulties together rather than trying to protect each other from harsh realities had made them both stronger and more capable of building the kind of future that Carmen would have wanted for their family. The crisis that had once threatened to destroy them had ultimately become the foundation for a more honest, resilient, and supportive relationship that would serve them well throughout their lives.